We're going to come on up. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today. Always a privilege. Hello, Robert. Hello, Bernadette, and all of my friends and family out there, the Morning Stars. Sending you so much love. Of course, over the past few days, have been at the Congressional Black Caucus weekend, and we've been talking about international issues, local issues, uh, national issues, everything. It was just a wonderful coming together of thousands of people, quite frankly. It was just tremendous. And so I'm kind of circling back today as we talk about the international. Nothing has been more consequential for so many reasons than this issue in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Palestine, Israel. Now, it turns out Prime Minister Netanyahu has come to the United States. It's unusual because Alex Nelson of If Not Now Chicago, Attorney Mark Fancher, and Professor John Quigley, indeed one of the most esteemed international lawyers and teachers of law uh, of this era. Uh, what's interesting is that he's come to the United States so many times this year. It's almost as if he's taken up residence here. And now there has been a call all over the world for a two-state solution. He is adamantly opposed to it. Do you think that there was anything that made him have another thought, a rethink about the two-state solution, given the fact that he spoke to the United Nations to an empty room? The applause that you heard, uh, the, the he was received by people he brought into the room with him. The overwhelming majority of the world, the delegates, the ambassadors to the United Nations, walked out as he started to speak. It's indicative of where the world is. Now, the world has been there, but what's interesting is now Europe is there. And this modern iteration of Israel is largely a creation of the United States and the UK. So it's a European construct. Um, so let's talk about this. I mean, what about this two-state solution? What about Benjamin Netanyahu saying that really this is about choosing between savagery and, or should he put it, the barbarism of these Palestinian people and the West? How racist, I must say. He said that in the press conference. It was very interesting watching this press conference at the White House with him and President Trump. President Trump, for his portion, talked a lot. He didn't seem very comfortable, and it seems that something is going on because now Jared Kushner, who's been absent from this administration largely, he was brought in. What's interesting about Jared Kushner, aside from him being the president's brother, used to be son-in-law, his father, of course, is now the ambassador to France. He's from one of the most prominent and one of the wealthiest families in the country. What's interesting is that Benjamin Netanyahu is a very, very close personal friend who used to sleep in his room when they were growing up. That's not unusual, but that's just how close Prime Minister Netanyahu is to that family. So one has to wonder what kind of deal was cut. They will not allow the Palestinians to have access to a military. They cannot choose their leadership. They said no to Hamas. They said no to the Palestinian Authority. And other things. And if these things, well, then you can have your land back, I guess. I don't know. So let's talk about this. And what about the two-state solution? Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? Well, it seems to be that it's increasingly likely because the world wants it to happen. So I want to know what your thoughts are. Everybody, please weigh in on the chat. Weigh in on the chat and like and share. Like and share. Meet me on Blue Sky, the Santita Jackson .bsky.social. That is that space where I can be reached on Blue Sky at Santita J on X. And I am the Santita Jackson and Friends page on Facebook, Santita Jackson IG on Instagram, and finally, right here on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. So, you know what? Let's get this started with Professor Quigley, the esteemed Professor John Quigley. What do you make of this meeting? This meeting with President Trump, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff, who oversees this particular issue for the White House. What say you, Professor Quigley?
Well, it's hard to know what to make of it. It's all being thrown out very quickly. Um, uh, I mean, on balance, it doesn't seem good, I have to say. I've been looking to try to find something good in it. There does seem to be a new, or I say revised or repeat role on humanitarian aid for the United Nations. I don't think they've mentioned the UNRWA organization specifically. But that would be something good. But the overall plan is very murky and does seem to relegate the Palestinians to the role of being governed rather than being those who are governing. The plan has been spelled out in a document that Tony Blair has produced, which I've seen for the first time in about an hour ago. And it calls for municipal leaders being Palestinians, so that at that level you would have Palestinians in an executive capacity in Gaza, but under the clear control of the higher organization, which is described as something of an international board, of which Mr. Trump would be the chief executive. Now, I mean, that on the face of it looks extremely negative. If it were totally a pro forma thing, maybe it could be not so bad, but it's hard to imagine that this could work out well, given that the Palestinians are being kept out of what you would call the higher reaches. Now, Mr. Trump said some rather interesting things about recognition of Palestine. He spoke rather favorably about the fact that allies of the United States are calling for the recognition of Palestine and that they are, in fact, recognizing Palestine. But then when Mr. Trump came on, he praised, when Mr. Netanyahu came on, he praised Trump for having opposed recognition of Palestine. And, Trump didn't answer that. But it seems that this would be a questionable thing, and even if there were general recognition, even by the United States, of Palestine, what would it mean when you don't have Palestinians in control of the government? Would the whole thing mean that the occupation continues? Netanyahu spoke about having what he called a security belt or something around Gaza, which is, of course, what they have had for the last decade. So to that extent, it seems as if the belligerent occupation would continue. It's not clear what kind of security force. Under Blair's document, there would be something called the security force, but I couldn't figure out exactly what that would be and who would staff that force. Um, so, um, what else? There is some uh, release of Palestinian prisoners in it, which is to the good, and release of something like 13 or 1400 people who have been detained in Gaza since 2023. So that's another positive thing. But the positives seem rather paltry in comparison with the overall picture. The Palestinian government, the PLO, seems to be excluded, except to the extent that it reforms itself. They don't even talk about PLO, they talk about the Palestinian Authority. And what Mr. Trump was saying is that it has to reform itself. And from the Blair document, it seems that that would mean that they have to throw away their school textbooks, um, uh, and that they have to stop going to the International Criminal Court and to the International Court of Justice. So those very important tools that the Palestinians have would be taken away, at least to the extent that the Palestinian leadership would be excluded from any kind of a control in governance until it agrees to that. So it looks like this provides for a significantly weakened Palestinian governing apparatus. So I've talked too long here, but these are some of the points that jump out at me.
Alex, what do you make of this? Do you just what are your impressions when you heard that the prime minister was going to be at the White House today, in the wake of what has happened at the United Nations in the past week? I mean, there's just a lot that has been going on. There's a lot of movement, and there's, of course, and you and your group have really taken the lead on this, really bending the conversation, and not just the conversation, the narrative, really pushing for a complete change in Israel, a complete change in our approach to the Middle East, and Gaza and the West Bank, Palestine. Mm-hmm. So, what do you make of what you're seeing now?
Well, so first of all, I don't take anything that either President Donald Trump or Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say in any sort of good faith. These are both fascist, genocidal maniacs, and they have no interests outside of their own pocketbooks and holding on to power. So I'm not particularly interested in the specifics of whatever they're proposing, because I know that they are going to do whatever they can to maintain a world regime that prioritizes their own power and their own worldview. And if they get to be Islamophobic and racist and cruel and anti-Palestinian and even anti-Semitic while they do it, well, then that's just so much the better. As has been said many times in the past decade or so, the cruelty is the point. And I think these are two people that seek cruelty amongst others, those that are much more defenseless and don't have access to systemic powers in the way they do. And I think that they like to bring down the weight of the state and the government upon them. In regards to so that's, if Benjamin Netanyahu is at the White House right now in this new, patio rose garden thing they've got going on, that's no surprise to me. It's two peas in a pod, being horrible to all those around him. I'm sure that to me, I can't imagine how deplorable it must be to be in a space with those two. But I think speaking more broadly about the conversation about a two-state solution, a one-state solution, to be honest, I don't try to get too bogged down into that, because what I want to see is a world in which all people who live between the river and the sea can live their freest and fullest lives. And that looks like they have access to the basic material human needs all humans need. That looks like access to food and water, hygiene, having a roof over your head, medical services, and then, more long-term, rebuilding an education system, infrastructure, all of these things that have been destroyed over the past 2 years of constant bombardment and starvation, not just literal starvation of food, but also starvation of other resources that the Palestinians need to maintain a civil society, things like fuel, things like access to the sea that the Gaza sits upon, access to their friends and family who live in the West Bank, who are also coming under the thumb of an increasingly tyrannical, authoritarian Israeli government. So, whatever governmental solution most enables the health and the safety and the longevity, but also the accountability for all of those who live between the river and sea is what I want to see long term. What I do know is that solution is not going to come from Netanyahu, and that solution is not going to come from Donald Trump. I think it's really important that we prioritize the Palestinians, both those that are still living in the Levant, but also those who are diasporic and who are living all around the world. And we really need to prioritize their voices and what they believe accountability and repair is going to look like after this genocide of their people.
Mark Fancher, what do you make of what we're seeing right now?
Well, I think that Jimmy Carter was really right on target when he analogized what he saw in that region to what was happening in South Africa under apartheid. And he branded what was happening in Palestine as a form of apartheid. And I think that if we're going to make that comparison and make that analogy, then let's stay with that and take it to its logical conclusion. And if we do, then we conclude that the two-state solution is not a solution at all. What it is it's the same type of stopgap measure that the apartheid regime tried to introduce when it saw that it was nearing its end. When the world had lined up against it and they saw that the apartheid system was no longer sustainable, what they came up with was something that was called separate development, and what most of us called Bantustans. In other words, they took the black ethnic groups in South Africa and said that they were going to allow them to be self-determining within boundaries that they claimed were historically aligned with those particular ethnic groups. Coincidentally, the Bantustans, or these areas that were going to be set aside for so-called separate development, were also the most barren, unproductive wastelands in what was then regarded as South Africa. And so ultimately, the only just resolution of that situation was to establish a single state, to give every person a vote, and to allow true democracy to reign. South Africa never went the full distance. They managed to establish something that resembles political democracy, but they never got to economic democracy, which is what really counts. And the strategy that was employed in South Africa was to basically head off what was going to be an imminent revolution, which would take the whole enchilada. It was going to take everything, the mines, the resources, the real estate, everything. They were going to take all of it. And so they negotiated through Nelson Mandela the establishment of a single state with political democracy, but not economic democracy. The Palestine faces a comparable kind of a challenge, I think, in that the two-state solution is now something that maybe Netanyahu and his ilk are beginning to grudgingly acknowledge as a possibility because they too see it as a stopgap measure. What happened at the United Nations was profound and dramatic. If you have not watched the video of all of the delegates and representatives in that hall standing up and filing out and leaving this pariah of a man standing there all alone in an empty chamber was something that just made my heart sing. And I think that once he and others begin to recognize that just like the apartheid regime became the pariah of the world, became the outcast, the reject. That government is now starting to see that it is becoming the same thing. And how do we deal with it? I think that we don't make the mistake that I think was made in South Africa, which is to try and negotiate something that's short of what represents real justice in that region, that we go the distance, that we demand a single secular state where everybody gets a vote, and the return of territory and resources to the Palestinian people, those who are indigenous to it, with no compromise whatsoever. That has to be the absolute and demand that for which we give nothing, because that's what's just. The territory was stolen from the indigenous people there. The Palestinians, by right, have a claim to it. Under law, under international law, they have a right to self-determination. They're entitled to a whole host of human rights that have been denied to them since 1948, and it's time. I think the world understands that situation far better than it has, since the founding of Israel, and the moment is right to push for everything.
Howard, you are of a different generation, and I say that with an appreciation of this fact. Mark and Dr. Quigley and I grew up. Mark and I were born. I think my brother Jonathan was the first one of my parents' 5 children who grew up with full voting rights. That happened in 1955. Having really probably the preeminent Black leader of that era run for president on an uncompromisingly progressive platform, huge. And the fact that he not only survived the price, he almost became the nominee, right? Mm-hmm. The possibility was stunning to us. But you grew up with a Black president. So much of what we fought for, you just take as a given. You know, like a woman being on the ticket, that was something that never pushed for, right? Mm-hmm. We grew up with, Mark and I grew up with a no-talk solution. You couldn't even mention Palestinians when we were growing up. Mark, you remember that. If you mentioned it, it was heresy. Mm-hmm. I'm asking you the question in that context. We come from a world that you can't even imagine. Mm-hmm. What does justice look like for you over there? Is it a 2-state solution? Is it a singular secular state? What does it look like to you? Because you freely call this an apartheid state. Mm-hmm. And Jimmy Carter was the single for that. But you said, without even thinking about it, what does justice look like for you over there?
First of all, thank you for flattering me. I'm not quite as young as you might think. The very first vote I ever cast was the Democratic primary, voting for Barack Obama in 2008. So, but that obviously was a different era. I was a believer that, we cast our votes and we usher in a new, hopeful, bright, progressive future. The world was our oyster. My, how things have changed. But speaking more towards your point about, what does it look like? As I said, what I'm most concerned with is the quality of life for the people who are actually living in the region, and most particularly the people who have been most marginalized and most subjected to the brunt of the militarization and authoritarian state that is Israel. So, freedom of mobility, the ability to not have to go through checkpoints, or have, in the case of folks who are in the West Bank, have streets that are unavailable to them due to military blockade or settler violence, the ability to access the healthcare you need when you need it, the ability to access your natural resources. As I mentioned earlier, the banks of the Mediterranean Sea are in large part off limits to the folks in Gaza. They can only go out and fish at like 6 meters or something like that, so they're prohibited from actually building an economy around the natural resources that are at least in terms of geographic proximity, available to them. Making sure that they have the resources they need to rebuild their vital infrastructure, to rebuild the housing after this a pretty unrelenting bombing campaign has destroyed, again, the streets, the roads, the plumbing, the sewer systems, the housing all around them. You know, when we talk about here stateside, when we have these infrastructure projects, we're always talking about them in the scale of, you know, many years to repair and these, you know, multi-million-dollar tabs that it takes to rebuild a highway or a bridge or something like that. The scale of what is going to be needed for restorative justice in Palestine is going to probably be certainly in the billions of dollars, possibly in the trillions of dollars. It is going to take a collective global effort to give them the resources they need to rebuild. And even that won't be sufficient because of the traumatizing circumstances under which people have been dying. You know, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people buried under the rubble. People have faced catastrophic injury from which they will never recover. You know, an entire generation of disabled children, many of whom are orphaned. The trauma that is just collectively experienced by everybody. So I think focusing and prioritizing on making sure that there is the well-being of the individuals that have borne the brunt of this genocide, and that they can start to rebuild a life in some capacity that looks to them like what a life should be. I think that needs to be our guiding star, and the governmental structures that we put in place need to serve that. And I generally don't think a two-state solution is going to be the answer for that. I think that we just, you know, the state of Israel as it exists right now cannot exist any longer. I think that we are going to, that is where the conversation really needs to begin. But for me, our North Star in all of this is the health and well-being of the Palestinians and how we can enable them to build a world that in some capacity makes amends for the trauma and the genocide that was done and inflicted upon them.
Dr. Quigley, what is slavery was legal, colonialism was legal, apartheid was legal. So many things which is morally wrong have been legal. Help me to understand what is the right thing, as you say. I mean, not just legally, but morally, because obviously that which is legal is supposed to be rooted in that which is moral, right? I mean, many people talk about going back to the pre-1967 borders. Is that possible? Is a two-state solution the best way? Is a secular one-state solution the best way? Many Israelis are afraid of being outnumbered. What are your thoughts?
I think Mark Fancher is right that it's a point in time just now when the international community needs to be looking for what should be done, and that we shouldn't be going for minor improvements. Although, you know, in the immediate period, we definitely need to be focused on what Alex Nelson is saying, that is to allow the people in Gaza, you know, to have a place to sleep tonight, tomorrow night, which they don't have. I mean, some of these videos that have been coming out of Gaza are just incredible. I mean, one of them I saw a couple of days ago was a young man explaining to his mother how they were going to have to live on the street that night. And they had just left their home. And this was the first night that they would have been outside of any kind of a dwelling. And he was trying to tell his mother that, you know, Allah had not forgotten them and that it would get better, you know. So you've got all of that. But if you want to talk about the people in Gaza in a broader way, that is what their rights are, nobody is talking about the fact that most of the people in Gaza are from families that were forced out of their home areas in Palestine in 1948. These are people that have a right, and we're just talking about strictly legal rights now. they have a right under international law to go back to where their families are from. And the fact that Israeli officials are preventing that from happening constitutes a crime against humanity as defined by the International Criminal Court. So that's an element that I think needs to be brought into the picture, whether one is talking about one state, two states, or something else. But it's getting lost, I think, over the last year, so you don't hear it mentioned. The Tony Blair plan, I was amused to see, uses the term right of return to mean that Gazans who want to go abroad should have the right to go back to Gaza. That's what the right of return has been whittled down to in that document. So I mean, I agree that a two-state solution is not in keeping with the self-determination right of the people of Palestine. And that for a very long time was the view of the PLO. Then in the 1980s, they decided that things were so bad that they weren't going to get anything, from the river to the sea, and that they would settle for a state in Gaza and the West Bank. And that has made it very difficult to talk about a single state, since the group that has been accepted as reflecting the self-determination of the population seems not to be working in that direction. Now, maybe, and this will go back to what Mark said about this being a point in time, maybe that will all change. But it does seem to be the ideal solution to have a single state in the area that was historic Palestine, and that would include those who have been forced out and the descendants of those who have been forced out.
Professor, quickly, how far back does that go? Many people who are up on popular culture, the Hadids, are very popular with young people, and they are Palestinian. And their grandparents were moved out. They said, they welcomed these Jewish people who were escaping persecution. They literally welcomed them into their homes, went on vacation and came home, and they could not get back in their homes. How does one work this out? Because so many Palestinians have been expelled. I mean, please, the Queen of Jordan is Palestinian. Make that make sense. How is this supposed to work out, Professor Quigley?
You mean as a practical matter, how could it be effectuated? I think it could. There are, there's a larger number of people there, of course, than there was in 1948. But various plans have been put out over the years as to how this could be done, especially given the fact that so many of those who have been pushed out and their families have made lives elsewhere and would not take advantage of an offer to go back to where their parents and grandparents or great grandparents had lived in the area. That was what I was working on, and others back around the year 2000, when there were discussions between the government, not the Netanyahu government, but the government of Israel of that time on the one hand, and the PLO on the other. And the same issue came up. What if all those Palestinians went back? Wouldn't that overwhelm the territory? And I think the practicality of it is that those choosing to return would be in sufficiently low numbers that it would not be that difficult. Now, you can't give voice to the so-called demographic argument of Netanyahu that the Palestinian Arabs need to be kept out in order to have a Jewish state. I mean, you've got to get past that argument, which has no basis in law.
Mark Fancher, I mean, how do we get to justice? Because, and I pose, I guess a similar question to you, because so many Palestinians are being expelled as we speak, Alex and Professor Quigley. I mean, that's happening now. It's hard. It's, I, to me, it's just incalculable, the loss of homes. I mean, for generations, they have been expelled. For generations. And I mean, how do we get, who comes back? Who has the right of return? How do you envision this working?
Yeah, I think it's a really easy thing to do if the world is prepared to be honest with itself about who they are, who we are as human beings, and what our basic rights are. One of the things that is really very much a part of the human experience historically is that those who want to do great evil, who want to commit the worst and most evil acts, have to in some way justify and rationalize what they're doing to satisfy those among the masses of people who have an instinctive love of justice and who are drawn just completely and totally toward the effort to be good people. And one of the methods that has been used historically is to ground the most evil acts in tenets and principles of law. And when that has been insufficient, to marry the law with religious tenets and with religious institutions. So that if you look back historically, you will see that the efforts to conquer territories that were occupied by people who were indigenous to these territories, when European explorers started ranging around the world and just taking over places, they couldn't do that to the satisfaction of the people of the nations from whence they came, unless they could say what we're doing is legal. And for them to just arbitrarily make up laws and legal principles that would justify what they were doing, even that was inadequate. And so what they did is they went to the Vatican. And what they got from the Vatican were the issuance of what were called papal bulls, which were edicts from the Pope that essentially said that these people who were going into these territories and colonizing them and enslaving people and all of that, this was permissible by virtue of God's will. That what they were doing was engaging in a civilizing mission, that they were going into these territories and bringing Christianity to the heathens and to the savages and to the pagans, and helping to bring them into close association with God. That's the way that they justified it. I see Israel and Palestine, that whole question, as being very comparable, in that what those who were the founders of political Zionism did is they said, we've got a population of European adherents to the Jewish faith who have been persecuted. They were the victims of atrocities in Nazi Germany and other places. And what we have to do is we have to protect them. And how do we do it? What they did was engage in a very cynical kind of a process where they used the prophecies of the Old Testament to rationalize and justify the conquest of a territory that was occupied by people. And then not only that, over the years and over the decades, what they have done is they've engaged in some of the worst patterns of atrocities against these people leading up to where we are now, which is genocide. And so the very idea that you're going to engage in genocide and the devastation and destruction of entire populations and their territories in God's name is something that I think when the world is prepared to look at that honestly, that they will reject. And I think we're getting there. As you said earlier, Santita, we grew up in a time when even the mention of Palestine, Palestinian rights was something that was forbidden. For us now to be at a point where the entire world rejects Netanyahu and is prepared to look realistically at the concept of political Zionism and possibly be prepared to reject that. Once they reach that point, then it becomes pretty much an academic question as to how and when people are allowed to return to territory that they rightfully occupy. It's just a question of getting it done and the world coming to their aid and to their assistance and helping them to reestablish themselves. And I think that we would be surprised by what I think Palestinians are willing to do and what they're capable of doing if they have the opportunity to come back. I'm not Palestinian, but I have heard Palestinians say that people would be surprised when they look at the devastation in Gaza. The fact that if given the opportunity, many of the people who have been displaced would come and they would sleep on the rubble as they were rebuilding it. And I think that level of commitment and love for their home is something that cannot be underestimated, and which I think offers a real clue as to how we move forward in this. And that is to allow people to come back, to rebuild, and to become self-determining.
Alex, help me to understand what kind of state this is. Because my understanding of Judaism, and my father is a seminarian. So I'm not only a preacher's kid, I mean, my father really studied not just the Bible, but he studied comparative religions. And he would share those studies with us. I think you understand that, Mark. And I'm so grateful for that. And some of the most wonderful books about practicable morality from our Jewish scholars and our rabbis, right? I mean, when I was going through a challenging time in my life, he wanted me to read The Courage to Be by Rabbi Heschel. He brought it into my room. He said, read this. This book can be a North Star for you, if you will. So help me to understand if this is, because I hear Prime Minister Netanyahu talk about, basically, he implies that we're supposed to refer this as a religious state. And I'm wondering if it's a religious state or if it's a Zionist state. Because what they're doing has nothing to do with Judaism as I understand it.
Yes, it is absolutely a Zionist state. And, there's obviously been, in large part, a very successful effort to conflate Zionism and Judaism, but they are two separate things. A common analogy you would actually see and hear a lot in anti-Zionist Jewish spaces and in non-Zionist Jewish spaces is the analogy of the golden calf. That is what Israel feels like to a lot of us. This misdirection of faith that is based on fear, based on privilege, based on any myriad of things. But that is a not uncommon metaphor that a lot of anti and non-Zionist Jews use, is that analogy of the golden calf and what Israel is to us. Judaism, as I was raised to embrace it and understand it, is much more about asking questions and thinking deeply about the world around us, and finding traditions that are based in prayer and ritual and song and community. Judaism, very famously, we don't have a defined set of beliefs in regards to the afterlife. You put two rabbis in a room and say what happens after you die and you're going to get 9 opinions. So this idea that there is something like Zionism that is an absolute fact, and this is how you must view the world, and this is how you must practice your Judaism, is inherently antithetical to the Judaism that I was, raised with. So what I will say is simply that I think that I do think this narrative is collapsing. I think now more than ever, or now more than in generations, folks are finally understanding that Judaism and Zionism are not synonymous. This is one of, if not now's, key organizing goals of the coming years, is how do we change the actual orientation of our beloved and longstanding Jewish organizations that have adopted this framework, and how do we turn them away from this worldview? That is not something I have an easy answer to. That is, the focus of my organizing work over the next several years, alongside many of my friends. But, Zionism to me is not only is it not the same thing as Judaism, but the way that Zionism has taken over, or the way that Zionism is practiced for all intents and purposes, is to me is a real conflation, or in real opposition to the values I was raised with. So I'm looking forward to a future where these two things can be separated entirely.
Professor Quigley, what should we be pressing for? I mean, it's very clear they've come up with this peace deal, and as you so clearly explained to us, it just does not, I don't see where the Palestinians win here. I mean, and in these negotiations, everybody should walk away happy, and and maybe not so happy, but that's a negotiation. I'm like, all the people who were negotiating, no Palestinians were at the table, Professor Quigley.
Mhm.
How do you hammer out a peace deal without the Palestinians?
Well, there has been some movement in the direction of another solution that in fact bears some similarities to what Mr. Trump is talking about. And this would involve the international community imposing severe sanctions on Israel, and at the same time organizing a military protective force that would go into Gaza. This is actually something that was proposed by the PLO many years ago. And it has gained some legs at the UN. The president of Colombia is promoting it very hard right now. And legally, it would be done by the General Assembly organizing a group of states on the basis of a resolution that was adopted during the Korean War, that says that when the Security Council is prohibited from dealing with a situation because of veto, that the General Assembly can organize in a non-mandatory fashion, organize a group of states to deal with a threat to the peace, which we certainly have in regard to Gaza. And if that were done in coordination with severe sanctions on Israel, that might improve the situation and lead to an outcome where you would have a real Palestinian government that would be in a position to control at least Gaza and the West Bank, and perhaps with the longer view in mind that once you have a real Palestinian government in those two sectors, that you could move in the direction of a single state.
Alex, do you think that having a different prime minister will make a difference, or not? Or will you need a change of mindset?
It depends on the prime minister. There are people in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet that are just as evil and violent as he is. And so, if one of them were to take his place, things would be just as bad or not worse. There are, folks in Israel who are maybe more liberal or progressive than Benjamin Netanyahu that would maybe be better in the short term, at least in terms of the ability to get food inside of Gaza, to get medical care inside of Gaza. But a real long-term solution is going to require that Palestinians have a seat at the table and actually determine the direction of the future of the Levant. And so we need to hear what a real, honest coalition of Palestinians representing different Palestinian voices, what they want for the future. I strongly suspect they say that a different prime minister will not be sufficient, and that what we really need to do is rebuild the entire government in the area from bottom to top, because it's an apartheid state, and it's always been an apartheid state. And I think the only way you can really dismantle, overcome an apartheid state is to dismantle the government that is built around apartheid in the first place and build something entirely new.
Well, I think that's a wonderful cues things up for you, Attorney Mark Fancher. What are your closing thoughts? I mean, what do you hope to see here?
I
Do we
think
need a
that,
change of mind or a change of administration, or does everything need to be dismantled and reconstructed?
oh, absolutely, it must be dismantled and reconstructed. And I think that what that situation represents is more than a political situation. It represents a spiritual disaster, compounded by great theological crimes, which are being committed in God's name. And I think that real change doesn't come from changing those in political office. It doesn't come from making this adjustment or that adjustment to an existing government structure. It has to come from the broad masses of people finally having not only a political awakening, but a spiritual transformation. And I think that if, to the extent that that's not happening, I think that we see the possibilities for it to happen as time goes on. More and more people who are Jewish and who live in Israel are spilling out into the streets because they've been so horrified by what is being done in their name and what's being done in God's name. That should come as a source of inspiration for the world. Because I think that once the people who are supposedly the beneficiaries of all of this this mass murder, this genocide, once they begin to reject it, then we're on the path to making a real change. And I think that certainly the people of Palestine are prepared to do what's necessary in order for them to maintain and build their dignity, their opportunities to exercise their rights to self-determination and to enjoy all of the human rights that are available. I think the world has the opportunity. Out of every negative, there can be a positive. And as negative as the genocide has been, it has allowed for people to finally see Palestinians as human beings. It has allowed for the world to begin to see the great evil that's represented by a Zionist regime. It has allowed people to see the contradictions of all of this. And I hope that it will drive people back to the scriptures. For those who are apologists for political Zionism, who claim that they have a right to this land by virtue of what the prophets have said, then go back and read what they actually said and see if it measures up against what they're actually doing. Because whereas the prophecies say that God is going to engineer redemption, these are people who said God's taking too long. He's not doing what it's up to us to do God's work for him, which is an insult to the most basic notions of what the Jewish faith is all about and what anybody who is a true believer in what God represents would be able to endorse. So out of all of this great tragedy comes great opportunity. It just depends upon how honest we all want to be and how committed we want to be to upholding the most fundamental tenets of Judaism, Christianity, and the basic human rights of all people, whoever they may be.
Professor, quickly, you have the final thought here. As we're wanting, they're calling it a peace summit, a peace deal.
Right. It doesn't look like that. I mean, what one needs to work towards is having real self-determination. Of course, have to get an end to the fighting as soon as possible. But the longer term is what we need to be focusing on. And I think that's what both Alex and Mark have been talking about. And I think we are at a point in time when that can be done. Look at what's happened just in the last couple of days in Italy. I mean, they've more or less shut down the country out of concern over what is happening to the Palestinian people. We haven't seen anything like that in any country of the world since the conflict started, back in the 1920s. So I think that's why Mark is right that we're at a point in time where we really need to be focusing on real solutions.
Everybody, well, we watch, we wait, we pray. But I tell you what, faith without works is dead. You must get involved. You must get involved. So much of the human story emanates from this one. Think about that, everybody. If we can resolve this, I think we can resolve anything. And resolve it we must. I think humankind, our very existence on so many levels rests upon this. So I want to thank you for being with us, and we're going to be back in a couple of hours just to talk about what women are really looking for, Alex. We have got a government shutdown that we're facing. We have had 319,000 Black women who've lost jobs between February and July. 319,000, and the hemorrhaging has not stopped. And white women gained 142,000 jobs. Hispanic women gained 176,000 jobs. White men gained more than 360,000 jobs. But we wonder how long that will last, given the advancements of AI. What is really going on here? And what are the top priorities? What are the top priorities? We need to talk about that. Increasingly, women, we contribute to these households or we head them up. Let's talk about that. In the meantime, I want to thank you, everyone, for being so patient as I've been dealing with these audio issues. It's a funny thing. I must make this quick observation. When you're in the progressive side of things, you deal with all kinds of technical and technological issues. I'm making no excuses, but as I go on, all kinds of things have been happening. I thank you for being so patient. You see, I don't hear anything now. There it is. And now that I'm about to get off the air, but I'm going to do the next show from my phone. I don't have problems there. How about that part? Think about it. You can't make this up. More of the Santita Jackson Show shortly on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. God bless.